your story, paint an emotion. Come on and dance in community. We've all got something to share. We've all got something to share.
Michael, it is a distinct honor to welcome you to our 21st anniversary banquet. Come and share with us your special wisdom.
Thank you, David, and it is a pleasure to be with you, all of you, tonight. As I was looking at the program, I was reminded of those marvelous biblical genealogies, Adam begat Cain, who begat Moses, begat Paul, and I thought, my God, it'll be hours before I ever get up here. And then my already truncated soundbite of a lecture will be just a brief spasm before I disappear. But as you can see, the genealogy is well worth the waiting. As the events unfold and you hear the narratives of people on the ground, and you hear the greetings, and you get the overarching sense of what community means, you come to appreciate that L'Arche isn't just a structure. It isn't just a movement. It is, in fact, a spirit. In a recent Globe and Mail exchange, I write for the Globe and Mail, and it's one of the great delights to see that they have decided to begin the reintroduction of significant word space to make an argument. For the longest time, we were becoming ever more truncated, and now we're getting the words back. And they had a lovely debate called The Great Disconnect, where the tech entrepreneur Jim Balsillie and the psychiatrist Norman Deutsch addressed issues around digital addiction, smartphone compulsivity, the social anxiety FOMO, the fear of missing out. And although the debate is interesting, or was interesting, who among us has not been touched by the ubiquity of social technology, with iTablets and their myriad spawn? In the end, however, the discussion rang rather shallow. Because communication, virtual or otherwise, digital or print, is only part of the human equation. It is communion that matters. It is covenant that matters. And that is what L'Arche is. L'Arche is not simply about communicating a message. L'Arche is about living that message. It is about embodiment. It is about physicality. It is about the body. The strengths and the weaknesses of the body, the challenges and vulnerabilities that we all possess. And this is one of the unique gifts of Henry Nouwen. Jean Vanier knew that. He knew Henry to his core. He knew the strengths and the yearnings. He knew the ambiguities and the struggles. He knew the failure as well as the joy. He knew that we flourish and we prosper when we embody, when we touch. Tactility is a very important thing in the thinking of Henry Nouwen, as it was for Jean Vanier. It is to hold the body. It is to touch the body. That is a form of reverencing. One of the reasons why when Henry died and others in the community died, he would insist on the casket being left open. So people don't fear the body, they touch the body. Tactility is what we mean in an important way when we talk about the sacraments being conduits of grace, being moments in which we encounter the native holiness of who we are. Nouwen loved daybreak, and daybreak liberated him. Daybreak gave meaning in the shards of his own depression and his own deep darkness. But daybreak also gave him a portal to joy. And you actually sit back and you consider what Henry Nouwen was. He was a priest of the Archdiocese of Utrecht. At a very young age, he told his cardinal, who had been a council father, that indeed he did not wish to study the sacred sciences. He wished to study psychology. He wanted to understand human motivation. So he was sent to the University of Nijmegen in the south of Holland. And there he began a lifelong exploration of the interstices, the points of connection between spirituality and psychology. This would take him to the Menninger Clinic for psychiatric research in Topeka, Kansas. And that would take him to the University of Notre Dame in South Bend, Indiana. And then he would go to Yale. And then he would go to Harvard. Now, what is really interesting in all of this is he didn't have a terminal degree. He was not highly credentialed. He was an unconventional academic. He was, in fact, Henry Nouwen. His classes were packed. He didn't play by the general rules. And as a former administrator, I continue to marvel, even 20 years after his death, how he managed so many sabbaticals. This guy was on more sabbaticals than anyone in an entire faculty would be on during the course of their tenure. He was always negotiating free time that would give him special time in the barrios and favelas of South America, in the monastery in Genesee, Pavard, in the northern New York State. Each occasion of these sabbaticals would bring him closer to a newer dimension of his own interiority and, very importantly, the key role of social justice in his life. People often criticize Nouwen for being a spiritual figure who dealt with nostrums and platitudes and feeling good kind of spirituality, but it lacked the grit and the viscera and the mire of genuine witness. That's nonsense. Within hours, or basically days, of having arrived in Topeka, he found out that there was a major march in Selma with Martin Luther King in 1965. So this chap, whose second language was English, who had barely landed in the United States, recognized that this was a kairos moment. This was a moment of the Lord. This was a moment when religious figures should be present, not hidden or invisible. So he rented a car, drove across a country he barely knew in order to be in a march in solidarity. And when he lived in a liberation community with the Marinolas in Peru and in Bolivia, and when he wrote a book about a martyr in Guatemala, he did this on the ground because he knew that it wasn't simply enough to write about spirituality, it was essential to live it. And that if social justice and spirituality did not conjoin, if they weren't married, if they were disparate, discrete units that had no connection, then your prayer life was empty and your witness similarly so. So it is important, I think, to appreciate that Nouwen's ending up at daybreak was a continuation of his mission. A mission that saw him in terms of a universal pastorship, of being with the broken because he was broken. Being with the handicapped because he was handicapped. Linking his life with the wounded because he was wounded. And he understood that all of us are vulnerable, and that our vulnerabilities are ways to grace. That if we live in genuine communion, not just communicating with each other from a safe, assured distance, but actually living in community, we get to know not only who we are and who others are, but indeed we see God's face. It's very important, I think, in reflecting on Nouwen and Nouwen's role at daybreak, to understand that he was a man who wrestled all his life with his body. Henry Nouwen was not happy with his body. It was ungainly, he was gangly, he was tripping over things. Those who knew him remember him gesticulating, his hands moving all the time. And he didn't carry himself with the grace of a protocol officer in the House of Windsor. This was a guy who could trip over anything, and did. He was not comfortable in his skin, and had never been. That level of discomfort with his body meant how important it was for him to recognize that if he, as his brother Lalonde now said to me, he sought to live vicariously in the bodies of others. Because he realized to be embodied is to be alive. He was no Gnostic, no Manichaean. There wasn't a separation of the soul versus the body here. There was the one union. But what he sought was the celebration of the body, a celebration that he somehow, at some key point, may be connected to that primary wound that he talked about, in which he felt deeply rejected at his core. That somehow the body would be the means in which he could become incarnate, infleshed, embodied, fully himself and fully alive. Well, you know, there was one occasion when you can actually see this happening, when he tasted divinity, when he tasted something of the richness and fullness of the body incarnate. And that was when he went to the circus. It was, of course, during, well, naturally, a sabbatical, when he discovered with his father that there was a circus in town. He went to the circus, and he wasn't particularly interested in the lions and the elephants and everything else. These were pre-politically correct days when we still carried these poor animals all over the place. Or the clowns or whatever. He was interested in the trapeze artists. He was so transfixed by the majesty of their movement, by the purity of their athleticism, by the choreography of their body and their talent, he was transfixed. And so what he did is what Henry always does. He becomes obsessed with something. So he just didn't go to one performance, he went to several performances. And he followed them throughout their trip in Germany. At first they were quite alarmed. Who is this unusual man who continues to go to all our shows, who sits there, who takes detailed notes and looks at us as if we were the divinity itself? And they befriended him. First, they approached him with some caution. I remember talking to Rodley Stevens, the founder of the Flying Rodleys, which is the trapeze group he's talking about. And at first, he said, we approached him tentatively. We thought, this is kind of a creepy chap, and what's he doing here, you know? And he said, we're used to people following the tent, as it were, and tent followers, and they're not always the best company. So we weren't quite sure about him. And then we discovered that he knew more about us than we knew about him. He would sit us down and he would explain to us the beauty of what we did, the nature of our art, its own spiritual ministry. He told us things about the aesthetics and the spirituality of trapeze performance, which we would never have considered, which was outside our horizon. He made us feel not only that we were artists, but that we were in some important way conduits of grace. They taught him about the power of the body and its beauty. And one of the last things you see that we have in videotaped is Henry being dropped into a net, which they had arranged for safety for him. And this was their gift to him. And you see this beatific smile on his face. For a special moment, he is at one with his body. For a special moment, the brokenness is forgotten. For a special moment, he's touched God. These are extraordinary things in the life of Henry Nouwen, and they are all typical of the ministry that he had in the community that he saw himself serving and being part of. He wasn't an outlier. He wasn't outside. He was an integral part of the L'Arche communion because they were essential to his own spirituality and to his own growth. They weren't an add-on. They weren't something to add to his CV. It wasn't the next stage in his career, although he would write many powerful books about the L'Arche experience, Daybreak to L'Arche and Adam being two of the most important. The fact remains, it was his home. Let me conclude with a wonderful image. When he was in the Abbey of Our Lady of the Genesee, the Trappist monastery in northern New York State, he kept a diary emulating his spiritual master, Thomas Merton. And one of the entries, he talks about reading a book by Gilbert Keith Chesterton. And many of you would know Chesterton. Some of you look old enough to remember Chesterton personally. But those of you who don't will know that Chesterton, GKC, was one of the great figures of the early English Catholic revival. He died in 1936, and he had the great wisdom, unlike many, to write his autobiography and die just before it was published, thereby ensuring that there would be no additional commentary or need to revise the autobiography in time. Thomas Merton envied that enormously. Merton had the great disadvantage of writing his autobiography at the age of 32, had to spend the rest of his life rewriting it. But in one of his biographies of several people, Blake, Chaucer, Dickens, a number of people, he was a prolific figure. Chesterton wrote one about Thomas Aquinas, and he wrote a specifically interesting one about Francesco da Bernardone, Francis of Assisi, simply called St. Francis of Assisi. It's a magnificent book. In that book, he talks about Francis as le jongleur de Dieu, God's tumbler. It's a medieval trope that just like the fool or the clown, you would have an entertainer that would entertain the king and entertain the royal family, but also in an important way was a religious and symbolic figure. The tumbler stood on his head and saw the world differently than the others, just like the fool would in the court. And there was wisdom in this. There was wisdom in God's tumbler. What is interesting to discover is that in many ways, Nouwen was God's tumbler. More often than not, he was the outlier and the misfit, standing on his head, looking at the world differently than others did. But what he discovered in that posture was something that was luminous, something that was transparently beautiful, something that was broken, yes, handicapped, surely, vulnerable, most definitely, but in all of that, as in all of matter, suffused with holiness. That's Henry Nouwen. Thank you.